Oliver Reed, a 29-year-old security officer at Orion Sky Terminal, was preparing for what he thought would be another uneventful shift. Little did he know, his encounter with a mysterious elderly man would alter the course of his day, and perhaps his life. Dressed impeccably in a neatly pressed beige jacket and clutching a slightly wilted bouquet of crimson roses, the old man had been a fixture in the terminal for several days. His quiet but constant presence had sparked curiosity and whispered speculations among the terminal staff and travelers. When Oliver finally decided to approach him, the truth he uncovered made his heart race with a cold urgency. Without hesitation, Oliver reached for his radio and called for assistance, knowing that each passing second was critical. But before diving into the heart of the mystery, take a moment to comment where you're reading or listening from. And if this story grips you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the expansive windows of Orion Sky Terminal as Oliver Reed adjusted his navy blue uniform, smoothing out a crease. The terminal was slowly coming to life, with the first wave of travelers arriving. The rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases against the polished floors added to the familiar symphony of the morning rush. Oliver, who had worked here for 5 years, scanned the area with practiced ease. What once was an exciting place full of constant motion and new faces had settled into predictable patterns for him. The daily flow of arrivals and departures was as steady as the tide. Faces changed, but the emotions, the hellos and goodbyes, the anticipation and farewells remained the same. As Oliver made his way through the arrivals hall, he observed the typical crowd. Business professionals glued to their phones, families with children craning their necks to spot a loved one, and weary travelers dragging themselves forward, their faces marked with exhaustion. It was a rich tapestry of human moments woven together in this temporary yet pivotal space. His eyes moved across the rows of benches, following his usual routine of observation, when something made him pause. An elderly man, likely in his 80s, sat alone on one of the benches. There was an undeniable air of distinction about him. Despite his slightly stooped posture, he carried himself with pride. The beige jacket he wore was spotless, and his shoes, though modest, gleamed with careful polish. Yet what truly caught Oliver's attention was the bouquet of roses resting gently in the man's lap. Beside the man sat a small travel pillow, an odd but practical accessory that contrasted with his otherwise formal appearance. His gaze scanned the bustling crowd, a mixture of hope and anxiousness etched across his face. There was a palpable anticipation in his demeanor, as though he was waiting for someone immensely important. Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen the man before, perhaps the day before, but with the constant flux of people, faces tended to blur together. As Oliver debated whether to continue on his rounds, the elderly man caught his eye and raised a hand, beckoning him over. There was a gentleness in the gesture, something so sincere that Oliver felt compelled to respond. "Excuse me, young man," the elderly gentleman began, his voice soft but steady. "I hate to trouble you, but could you tell me when Flight 418 is set to arrive?" Oliver was taken aback, not by the question, but by the man's polite and deliberate tone. A stark contrast to the hurried, often impatient travelers he dealt with regularly. "I'm sorry, sir," Oliver replied with a friendly smile. "As part of security, I don't have access to flight schedules, but if you check the digital board over there," he said, pointing to a large screen across the hall, "you'll see all the arrival times listed." The man's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you so much. I'm terribly sorry to have disturbed you. It's just that I'm waiting for someone very special, and I wouldn't miss her arrival for the world." The sincerity in his words, laced with a touch of nervous excitement, struck a chord in Oliver. He found himself smiling, his curiosity now piqued. The encounter was brief, but lingered in Oliver's mind as he continued his rounds, unaware that it was the start of something that would challenge and change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Oliver couldn't help but feel a genuine warmth from the elderly man's excitement and unfailing politeness. "No problem at all, sir," Oliver replied. "I hope you meet your special someone soon. Good luck." As Oliver resumed his rounds, a small smile lingered on his face. The encounter had been brief, but there was something endearing about the man's demeanor. a glimpse of an era that valued patience and courtesy in a way that felt increasingly rare. For Oliver, it became a pleasant memory to file away as part of his day, not realizing it was the prelude to something far more profound. The rest of the day unfolded as it usually did. Oliver managed the usual assortment of minor inconveniences: lost luggage, disoriented travelers, and a few routine security concerns. By the time his shift ended, Oliver was ready to head home and relax. Walking out of the security office, his thoughts had already drifted to his plans for the evening. However, as he passed through the arrivals hall one last time, the scene struck a different tone. The golden light of the setting sun poured through the large windows, casting long shadows on the now quiet space. The bustling crowd from earlier had dwindled to just a handful of lingering travelers. And there he was, the elderly man from that morning. He was still seated in the same spot, his bouquet of roses carefully balanced in his lap. The sight made Oliver stop in his tracks. The man's posture was more slouched now, his energy seemingly drained after a day of waiting. His eyes, which had sparkled with hope earlier, seemed dimmer, tinged with a quiet anxiety that Oliver could sense even from afar. Before he could stop himself, Oliver called out, "Sir, did you manage to find the person you were waiting for?" The elderly man looked up, startled by the familiar voice. A flicker of something, disappointment or perhaps embarrassment, crossed his face before he answered softly, "Not yet. She should be here soon, though." He hesitated, then forced a polite smile. "Have a nice evening." Oliver, now standing near the exit, raised a hand in a farewell wave. "You too, sir. Take care." As Oliver stepped outside into the warm evening air, the unsettling feeling from the encounter lingered with him. He tried to shake it off as he made his way to his car, but the image of the man, alone on that bench, clutching his roses, remained vivid in his mind. On the drive home, Oliver's thoughts kept circling back. It didn't make sense for someone to wait that long. Could it have been a delayed flight? He had pointed the man toward the arrivals board earlier, so surely he would have noticed if there was a significant delay. The more Oliver thought about it, the stranger it seemed. The travel pillow stood out in his memory. Was it a sign that the man had come prepared for a long wait, or was there something else behind it? At one point, Oliver even considered the possibility that the man might be homeless and seeking refuge in the airport. But that didn't fit with his refined attire or the way he held himself. Shaking his head, Oliver dismissed the thoughts as overthinking. "It's probably nothing," he muttered to himself. "Just an unfortunate delay or a minor mix-up, things that happen all the time in a busy airport." Yet, even as he told himself this, he couldn't completely banish the image from his mind. When Oliver finally arrived at his modest apartment, the quiet felt oppressive. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of cars passing by on the street outside were the only noises to break the stillness. He sat at his small dining table, absent-mindedly poking at his reheated dinner. The TV was on in the background, but Oliver wasn't paying attention. His thoughts remained fixed on the elderly man at the terminal. Pulling out his phone, Oliver scrolled through social media in an attempt to distract himself. Usually, this routine helped him unwind, but tonight it felt hollow. The photos and updates from his friends seemed trivial compared to the quiet mystery that had taken root in his mind. Who was the man waiting for? Why had no one come for him all day? And why, despite his own logic and attempts to dismiss it, did Oliver feel so unsettled by the whole situation? Oliver set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples in an attempt to clear his thoughts. He tried once more to rationalize what he'd seen. Airports were places of waiting, after all. Delays happened all the time. The elderly man's loved one might have been stuck in transit, or maybe there had been some kind of mix-up about the arrival time. And yet, something about that explanation didn't sit right with him. The man had been there all morning, and he was still sitting in the same spot when Oliver left that evening. That wasn't just a delay. That was something else entirely, wasn't it? Unable to shake the unease, Oliver got up and started pacing the length of his small living room. He replayed the interactions in his mind, searching for clues he might have overlooked. The man's polite demeanor, the delicate way he held the bouquet of roses, the mixture of hope and anxiety in his eyes. It all pointed to someone eagerly awaiting a reunion. So why hadn't anyone come? As Oliver's gaze wandered, it landed on a framed photo on his bookshelf. It was a picture of him with his late grandmother, taken just months before she passed away. The sight stopped him mid-step. Oliver's grandmother had spent her final years alone, her children preoccupied with their own lives and her friends slowly fading away. He could still see the loneliness in her eyes sometimes, even when she smiled and told him she was fine. The memory tugged painfully at his heart. Was that what he'd seen in the old man's eyes? Not just anticipation, but a deeper, aching loneliness? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. He was projecting, wasn't he? Drawing connections where none existed? And yet, no matter how much he tried to convince himself, Oliver couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story than a simple delay. As he prepared for bed, the thoughts continued to circle in his mind. Mechanically, he brushed his teeth, replaying every detail of his interactions with the elderly man. The gentle way he had asked about the flight, the careful grip he maintained on the roses, the wariness that clouded his hopeful gaze by the end of the day. Climbing into bed, Oliver hoped sleep would bring him peace. Instead, he found himself staring at the ceiling in the dark, unable to quiet his swirling thoughts. The image of the man, alone on that bench, waiting, hovered before his eyes. What if the person he was waiting for never came? What if the man was still there, sitting on that bench, waiting through the night? The thought made Oliver's stomach twist with unease. He rolled over and punched his pillow in frustration. This was absurd. He didn't even know the man. Why was he letting this bother him so much? But deep down, Oliver knew why. There had been a vulnerability in the man's quiet dignity, a quiet strength in the face of what might be crushing disappointment. It reminded Oliver of his grandmother and the loneliness she had endured as the world rushed on around her. The night passed in a restless haze. When Oliver finally drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams were a confusing jumble of airport terminals, empty benches, wilting roses, and fleeting connections. And always, at the center of it all, was the elderly man, a silent sentinel waiting in a sea of passing faces. When his alarm blared the next morning, Oliver awoke feeling anything but rested. The unease of the previous night clung to him like a heavy fog. As he dressed for his shift, he made a quiet promise to himself. Today, he would get to the bottom of this mystery. He owed it to the man, and to himself, to find out what was really going on. The early morning air was crisp as Oliver arrived at Orion Sky Terminal earlier than usual. A mixture of curiosity and concern had driven him to get a head start on his day. At this hour, the terminal was still sleepy, populated by a handful of early travelers and the night shift staff wrapping up their duties. As Oliver walked through the arrivals hall, a strange sense of déjà vu settled over him. His pace slowed as he approached the area where he had first seen the elderly man the day before. From a distance, Oliver spotted the figure on the same bench, and his pulse quickened. As he drew closer, his suspicions were confirmed. It was the same elderly man. But the sight before him made Oliver's chest tighten with a wave of concern. The man was asleep, his head resting against the small travel pillow Oliver had noticed the day before. The bouquet of roses, now visibly wilted, remained cradled in his lap, loosely held by fingers that still sought to protect it, even in sleep. Oliver stood for a moment, taking in the scene. The man's once elegant beige jacket was now slightly rumpled, his polished shoes scuffed after a full day spent waiting. In sleep, his face seemed older and more vulnerable. The lines of worry and hope that had animated it the previous day now softened into the slack expression of pure exhaustion. A wave of emotions swept over Oliver, concern, sadness, and a growing sense of unease. Spending long hours in the airport was one thing, but this man had clearly spent the night here. That wasn't normal. Something was definitely wrong. Oliver felt the urge to wake the man, to ask him what was going on, and to offer his help. But as he looked at the man's peaceful, exhausted face, he hesitated. After what was likely a day of disappointment, followed by an uncomfortable night on the airport bench, Oliver couldn't bring himself to disturb what little rest the man had found. Reluctantly, Oliver turned away and headed to the security office, though his thoughts remained with the man on the bench. As he changed into his uniform, the image of the elderly man stuck in his mind. The wilted roses, the wrinkled clothes, the weary slump of his shoulders. It all painted a picture of someone enduring prolonged disappointment, and the thought tugged at Oliver's heart. As he began his shift, Oliver made a silent vow he would keep an eye on the man throughout the day. If the situation hadn't changed by the afternoon, he would intervene, awkward or intrusive as it might feel. Something wasn't right, and Oliver felt a growing responsibility to uncover the truth. The hours stretched ahead, filled with the usual routines of his job, but Oliver couldn't shake the quiet tension in the back of his mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to the man on the bench. Who was he waiting for so patiently? Why hadn't they come? And most pressing of all, what could Oliver do to help? He glanced at the clock more frequently than usual, counting down the hours until he could check on the elderly man again. During quiet moments between his tasks, Oliver found himself imagining different scenarios. Perhaps the man was waiting for a long-lost love, someone he hadn't seen in decades. Or maybe he was hoping to reunite with an estranged family member, and a misunderstanding had caused the delay. But each possibility seemed to raise more questions than answers. As lunchtime approached, Oliver resolved to find out what was really happening. He couldn't let the day pass without at least trying to help. This time, he decided, he would speak to the man and engage him in conversation. Whatever the truth was, Oliver needed to ensure the gentleman was okay. With a mix of determination and apprehension, Oliver headed back toward the arrivals hall. Whatever mystery surrounded the waiting man, Oliver was committed to seeing it through. He couldn't have known it then, but this decision would spark a series of events that would test his compassion, challenge his understanding, and ultimately change his life forever. As Oliver approached the bench, he saw that the elderly man was awake. Though tired, his eyes still carried that blend of hope and anxiety that Oliver had noticed the day before. The bouquet of roses, now drooping and faded, remained clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Taking a deep breath, Oliver steeled himself for the conversation to come. Oliver knew he had to tread carefully, balancing respect for the man's privacy with his growing concerns. Steeling himself, he approached the bench and said, "Excuse me, sir." His tone was gentle but firm. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right? I couldn't help but notice you've been here since yesterday." The elderly man looked up, his face lighting with a flicker of recognition as he took in Oliver's uniform. For a moment he appeared startled, as if suddenly aware of how much time had passed. "Oh yes, yes," he replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Everything's fine, young man. I'm just waiting for someone. They'll be here soon, I'm sure of it." Oliver nodded, but the answer did little to ease his worry. Deciding to press gently, he continued, "Sir, I don't mean to pry, but you've been here quite a while. Have you had anything to eat? Is there someone I can call for you?" The man's expression softened at Oliver's evident concern. "You're very kind to ask, but really, I'm fine. My friend will be here any moment now. I don't want to miss her arrival." Oliver hesitated, then opted for a more direct approach. "Sir, I apologize if this seems forward, but do you have a place to go? The airport isn't really a place for extended stays." At this, the elderly man's composure faltered briefly. A shadow of distress crossed his face before he managed to regain his calm demeanor. "Oh no, young man, you misunderstand. I'm not homeless, if that's what you're thinking. I have a lovely home. It's just, well, it's very important that I'm here when she arrives." Relieved to hear that the man wasn't homeless but still troubled by the situation, Oliver nodded. "I understand, sir, but perhaps we could find a more comfortable place for you to wait, or maybe check on the status of the flight you're expecting." The man shook his head, his refusal gentle but resolute. No, that won't be necessary. I'm quite comfortable here, and she'll be here soon. Very soon." There was something in his voice, a mix of hope and desperation, that tugged at Oliver's heart. He realized that pushing further might only cause the man to withdraw completely. "All right, sir," Oliver said, conceding for the moment. "But please, if you need anything, water, food, or any kind of assistance, don't hesitate to ask for me. My name's Oliver, and I'll be here all day." The man smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his fatigue. "Thank you, Oliver. You're a good young man. Your parents must be very proud." As Oliver walked away, his mind raced. The conversation had done little to ease his concerns. If anything, it deepened them. While the man wasn't violating any rules, his extended stay was far from normal. Something was clearly amiss. Oliver resolved to keep a close eye on him for the rest of the day. He would ensure the man had water and maybe even bring him some food from the cafe. But if there was still no sign of the person he was waiting for by the end of his shift, Oliver knew he would need to take more decisive action. Throughout the day, Oliver found himself circling back to the bench more often than his duties strictly required. Each time he passed, the man was still there, alert, watchful, with the now drooping roses still held in his lap. The hope in his eyes seemed to fade with each passing hour, replaced by a quiet anxiety that Oliver found increasingly difficult to ignore. As his shift neared its end, Oliver made a decision. He couldn't leave without getting to the bottom of this. With determination and a touch of apprehension, he approached the bench once more. "Sir," Oliver began, his voice soft but firm, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm concerned about you. You've been here for quite a while now. Is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps we could try to contact the person you're waiting for?" The elderly man looked up at Oliver, and for a moment it seemed as if he might dismiss the concern again. But then, something shifted in his expression. The polite mask of patience fell away, revealing a vulnerability that made Oliver's heart ache. "You're very kind, young man," the gentleman said, his voice trembling slightly. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to talk about it." He hesitated before adding, "My name is Gerald Walters." Oliver nodded and sat down beside Gerald, keeping a respectful distance but leaning in to better hear the older man's quiet voice. "It's nice to meet you properly, Mr. Walters. I'm Oliver Reed. Can you tell me about the person you're waiting for?" Gerald's eyes lit up, a faint smile appearing at the corners of his mouth. "Her name is Eliza. She's the most incredible woman I've ever known." As Gerald spoke, he pulled out his phone, his aged fingers surprisingly nimble as he navigated the screen. He brought up a photo of an elderly woman, her silver hair framing a face lined with laughter and warmth. Her eyes sparkled in a way that radiated kindness. "We've been talking online for 2 years now," Gerald said, his voice a mix of pride and longing. "Can you believe it? At my age, finding love again, it feels like a miracle." Oliver listened intently, though a growing unease twisted in his stomach. Online dating wasn't uncommon, but there was something about this situation that felt wrong. Gerald began scrolling through his phone, showing Oliver snippets of text messages filled with affection and tender words. "We've never met in person," Gerald admitted, "but she's everything to me. She lives in Africa, you see, but now she's finally coming here. She has cancer, and she's coming for treatment. I'm going to help her, take care of her." Oliver's heart sank as the pieces began falling into place. Keeping his tone steady, he asked, "Mr. Walters, this must be expensive. The travel, the medical treatments." Gerald nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Oh, it is, but she's worth every penny. I've brought $33,000 in cash with me. It's everything I have. But what good is money if you can't use it to help the ones you love?" The quiet alarms in Oliver's mind turned deafening. Cash, online dating, a distant country, medical treatment. It all pointed to one devastating conclusion. Oliver swallowed hard, carefully choosing his words. "Mr. Walters, when was Eliza supposed to arrive?" Gerald's expression faltered. "Well, she was meant to be here 2 days ago, but there was an issue with her flight. She needed more money to rebook her ticket, so I sent it to her. She should be here any moment now." A wave of sadness and anger surged through Oliver. This kind-hearted, hopeful man had been ensnared in a cruel scam. But how could Oliver break it to him? How could he destroy the hope that had carried Gerald through these past 3 days? Before Oliver could figure out how to respond, Gerald's phone buzzed. The old man's face lit up as he read the message. "It's her," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with excitement. "She says she's just landed and will meet me at the exit in 10 minutes. She's reminding me to bring the money." Joy radiated from Gerald's face as he turned to Oliver. "You see? I told you she'd come. Love always finds a way." It felt like a punch to the gut. Oliver knew what was about to unfold, the brutal conclusion of this elaborate scam. He made a split-second decision. "Mr. Walters," Oliver said, his voice firm but kind, "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Gerald looked confused by the sudden shift in Oliver's tone, but after a moment he nodded hesitantly. "I'm going to take your phone for a moment," Oliver explained, keeping his voice calm. "And I'm going to call for some help. I promise I'll explain everything, but right now I need you to stay here and not move. Can you do that for me?" Still puzzled, Gerald nodded again, handing over his phone with a trembling hand. As Oliver stepped away to make the call, his heart ached for the man sitting on the bench, still holding on to his roses, still clinging to the belief that his long-awaited love was just minutes away. With a heavy heart but unwavering determination, Oliver took the phone and stepped away. He quickly called for backup, explaining the situation in hushed, urgent tones. As he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to Gerald, who remained seated on the bench, clutching his wilted bouquet of roses and staring at the exit. The older man's eyes were filled with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy, waiting for a woman who would never arrive. Oliver knew the next few minutes would devastate Gerald, but he also knew he couldn't stand by and allow this kind, hopeful man to be robbed of his life savings. With backup on the way, Oliver steeled himself for what was to come. The story that had been quietly unfolding over the past 3 days was now racing toward its climax, and Oliver was determined to ensure that, no matter the heartbreak, it wouldn't end in disaster. His heart pounded as he returned to Gerald's side. Gerald still sat on the bench, his phone in one hand and the roses in the other, his eyes darting anxiously between the exit doors and the phone screen. The mix of hope and anxiety on his face was almost too much to bear. Within minutes, Oliver's fellow officers began arriving, dressed in plain clothes and blending seamlessly with the crowd of travelers. Their movements were subtle but deliberate, positioning themselves strategically near the exit. Oliver caught the eye of Officer Lauren Hayes, who gave him a small nod of confirmation. He returned the gesture, signaling that everything was in place. Turning back to Gerald, Oliver spoke softly. "Mr. Walters, are you all right?" Gerald looked up, a faint, trembling smile breaking through his nervousness. "Oh yes, he said, though his voice wavered. "Just a bit jittery, I suppose. It's our first time meeting in person, you see. I hope I look like my photos." Oliver felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted nothing more than to tell Gerald the truth, to prepare him for what was about to happen. But he knew it wasn't the right moment. The priority now was to keep Gerald safe and catch the people who had taken advantage of his trust. "I'm sure it'll be fine," Oliver said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Now, remember what I said. Stay right here, okay? No matter what happens, don't move from this spot. Can you promise me that?" Gerald nodded, though the confusion in his eyes deepened at Oliver's insistence. "Of course, young man, but why?" "It's just airport procedure," Oliver lied smoothly. "For security reasons, trust me, okay?" Gerald hesitated but eventually nodded again. "All right, if you say so." Oliver's radio crackled softly, and he heard the calm but deliberate voices of his team signaling that they were in position. The tension in the air was palpable. All they could do now was wait for the scammers to make their move. Gerald, still unaware of the drama unfolding around him, continued to focus on the exit doors with eager anticipation. Oliver's hand rested near his concealed weapon, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. His primary goal was the safety of Gerald and everyone else in the terminal. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, every second heavy with anticipation. The airport's usual rhythm, the murmur of conversations, the hum of luggage wheels, the occasional crackle of an intercom, continued around them, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Oliver found himself studying Gerald's face, noting the lines etched by years of life, now softened by hope and excitement. He knew that soon those lines would transform into ones of disappointment and heartbreak. It was painful to watch, but Oliver reminded himself of the importance of what they were doing, not just to protect Gerald, but to prevent others from falling victim to the same cruel scam. As Oliver waited, he steeled himself for what was to come, knowing that the next moments would change Gerald's life forever. The waiting felt endless. Oliver checked his watch, then scanned the crowd again, his senses heightened. His team stayed sharp, their eyes constantly moving as they searched for any sign of the suspects. The usual airport noises, The hum of conversation, the rolling of suitcases, the periodic announcements over the PA system, all faded into the background as Oliver focused intently on the task at hand. Finally, there was movement near the entrance from the parking lot. Oliver's pulse quickened as he spotted two men entering the terminal. Their eyes swept over the crowd with intent, their black jackets and caps giving them an air of casual anonymity that felt anything but casual to Oliver. The men moved through the terminal with a deliberate ease, their eyes scanning the sea of faces until they landed on Gerald. Oliver's heart raced. This was it. As the two men approached, Oliver could see their eyes dart to the roses in Gerald's lap and the eager, expectant expression on his face. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent confirmation that they had found their mark. Oliver's breath caught. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring into action. He watched as Gerald's expression shifted to one of confusion. He clearly hadn't been expecting these men to approach instead of Eliza. "Team, move in," Oliver barked into his radio, stepping forward in one swift motion. In an instant, the scene erupted into controlled chaos. Oliver's team moved with precision. Officer Lauren Hayes tackled the shorter man just as his hand emerged from his pocket, sending something skittering across the floor. A phone, not a weapon, Oliver noted with relief. The taller suspect tried to flee, but was quickly intercepted and cornered by two other officers. Meanwhile, Oliver placed himself protectively in front of Gerald, who sat frozen in shock, his bouquet of roses tumbling from his grasp onto the floor. "Airport security, don't move." Oliver's voice boomed with authority, cutting through the commotion. Nearby travelers gasped, instinctively backing away. A circle of space formed around the unfolding drama. Some onlookers pulled out their phones to record, while others hurried away, eager to avoid becoming involved. The two suspects, realizing they were outnumbered and trapped, raised their hands in surrender. Oliver could see the panic in their eyes, the sudden understanding that their carefully orchestrated scheme had spectacularly unraveled. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Officer Hayes commanded, her voice sharp and commanding. The suspects complied, dropping to the floor as Oliver's team swiftly moved in to secure them. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed through the now hushed terminal. As the officers patted the men down, they retrieved phones, wallets, and a small notebook, likely containing details of their operations. Amid the chaos, Oliver kept one hand firmly on Gerald's shoulder, both to reassure him and to prevent him from intervening. With the immediate threat neutralized, Oliver turned his full attention to Gerald. The elderly man's face was a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, his eyes darting between the two handcuffed men and Oliver. "Oliver," Gerald stammered, his voice trembling. What's going on? Where's Eliza?" Oliver's heart twisted at the devastated look in Gerald's eyes. Gently, he guided the older man back to the bench and helped him sit down. "Mr. Walters, Gerald," Oliver began, his voice soft but steady. "I'm so sorry, but there is no Eliza. These men," he gestured to the suspects now being escorted away, "were running a scam. They were trying to take your money. But you're safe now. We've got them." Gerald's knees seemed to buckle as he sank onto the bench. The reality of the situation crashed over him, leaving him slumped and silent. Tears filled his eyes, spilling over as he whispered, No, it can't be." His voice was so faint it was almost lost in the renewed bustle of the airport. The bouquet of roses lay scattered on the floor, their wilted petals a heartbreaking symbol of Gerald's shattered dreams. Oliver knelt down, carefully gathering the scattered roses from the floor. As he held the battered bouquet in his hands, he made a silent promise to Gerald and to himself. No matter what it took, he would see this through. The chaos of the arrest had faded and the suspects were being escorted away. But Oliver and Gerald remained on the bench, enveloped in a bubble of stunned silence amid the bustling activity of Aurora Terminal. Gerald's hands trembled as he reached for one of the fallen roses that Oliver had collected. Its petals, bruised and wilting, seemed a cruel reflection of his own broken heart. "No Eliza," he murmured, his voice barely audible. It was all a lie. Oliver felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the elderly man grapple with the painful truth. "I'm so sorry, Gerald," Oliver said softly, sitting beside him on the bench. "These scammers are professionals. They prey on kind-hearted people like you. This isn't your fault. But Gerald wasn't listening. His hands, shaking visibly, pulled his phone from his pocket. He began scrolling through the messages and photos he'd exchanged with Eliza over the past 2 years. What had once been a source of immense joy now cut through him like a blade. "We talked every day," Gerald said, his voice breaking. "She knew everything about me. My hopes, my fears, my dreams for the future. She said she loved me." He looked up at Oliver, tears streaming down his face, his expression a mix of sorrow and disbelief. How could it all be fake? How could someone do this? Oliver struggled to find the right words. How could he explain the depths of human cruelty to someone whose heart was so full of love? "Gerald," Oliver began carefully, "these scammers are incredibly skilled. They take time to build trust, to make their victims feel special and loved. But it's all a ruse. They only care about getting money. They don't think about the pain they cause." Gerald's face crumpled as the weight of the deception fully hit him. "The money," he whispered, his gaze falling to the bag at his feet that contained his life savings. "I was going to give her everything. I thought I'd found love again. After my wife passed, I never thought I'd feel that way again. And now—" The anguish in Gerald's voice was almost too much for Oliver to bear. Faced with such raw and immediate grief, he found himself at a loss for words. What could he say to ease the pain of such profound betrayal? Gerald clung to his phone, his eyes fixed on Eliza's profile picture, as though searching for answers. "Maybe she's real," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Maybe she just got mixed up with these bad men. She could still be out there waiting for me. We had plans, Oliver. We were going to travel, see the world together." Gently, Oliver placed his hand over Gerald's, guiding the phone down. "Gerald," he said, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "I know this is hard to accept, but Eliza isn't real. The person in those photos, the one you've been talking to, it was all part of the scam. Those men created her, used her to manipulate your feelings. I'm so sorry." The truth sank in slowly, breaking down Gerald's final defenses. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. Silent sobs racked his body as the shattered remnants of his dreams spilled out. The roses lay forgotten on the bench beside them, their wilting petals a poignant symbol of Gerald's heartbreak. Oliver sat quietly, offering his presence as a small measure of support, as Gerald mourned the loss of something that had meant so much to him. Around them, the terminal's life continued uninterrupted. Travelers rushing past, oblivious to the heartbreak unfolding in their midst. A few onlookers cast sympathetic glances, but most were too caught up in their own journeys to notice. As Gerald's sobs began to subside, Oliver knew that while the immediate crisis was over, the true challenge was just beginning. The pain of betrayal would linger, and rebuilding trust and hope would take time. But as Oliver sat beside Gerald, he resolved to help him take those steps forward. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but Gerald wouldn't have to face it alone. He gave Gerald's shoulder a gentle squeeze, drawing the older man's attention. "Gerald," Oliver said softly, his voice full of compassion, "I know this is overwhelming right now, but I want you to know you're not alone in this. I'll be here to help you through it, every step of the way." Gerald looked up at Oliver, his red-rimmed eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to age him even more. His voice, hoarse from crying, broke as he asked, "Why? Why would you want to help me? I'm just a foolish old man who fell for a lie. I should have known better." Oliver shook his head firmly, his gaze meeting Gerald's with unwavering sincerity. "No, Gerald, you're not foolish at all. You're a kind, loving person who believes in the goodness of others. That's not something to be ashamed of. If anything, the world needs more people like you, not fewer." Reaching into his pocket, Oliver pulled out a business card and pressed it gently into Gerald's trembling hand. "Here's my number," Oliver explained. "I want you to call me anytime, day or night, if you need to talk, or if you need help with anything related to this. And I mean anything, Gerald, whether it's about the legal process or just needing someone to listen when things feel tough." Gerald stared at the card, turning it over in his hands as though it were a rare treasure. A mix of gratitude and uncertainty flickered across his face. I don't know what to say, Oliver. You've already done so much. I couldn't possibly impose on you." "You're not imposing," Oliver replied gently. "I want to help." He paused before continuing, his tone calm but reassuring. "And there's something else we need to discuss. What happens next?" Gerald's expression turned apprehensive, but Oliver pressed on. "We're going to need to file a report about this scam, and you may need to speak with some investigators. I know that might feel daunting, but I'll be right there with you. We'll make sure your story is heard and do everything we can to stop these scammers from hurting anyone else." Oliver hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "And Gerald, I think it might be a good idea to talk to someone, a professional, about what you've been through. A counselor or therapist who specializes in helping people recover from fraud can help you process everything you're feeling." Gerald nodded slowly, the weight of the situation still evident in his posture. "I suppose that might be a good idea," he admitted quietly. I feel so ashamed. How could I have been so gullible?" Leaning forward, Oliver spoke with firm kindness. "Gerald, listen to me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. These scammers are professionals. They exploit the best qualities in people: kindness, hope, love. You're a victim of a crime, nothing more." Tears welled up in Gerald's eyes again, but this time there was a faint glimmer beneath them. Gratitude, perhaps, or the first fragile spark of resilience. Oliver felt a swell of protectiveness. He thought about what Gerald had shared earlier, that he had no family left to turn to. The idea of this kind man facing the aftermath of such betrayal on his own was unbearable. "Gerald," Oliver said, his voice steady, "I know we've only just met, but I want you to know I'm here for you. Not just as a security officer, but as a friend. We're going to get through this together, okay?" To Oliver's surprise, Gerald reached out and pulled him into a hug. His voice, thick with emotion, was barely a whisper. "Thank you for saving me from this," Gerald said, his voice trembling with emotion, "and for caring. It means more than you know." He looked at Oliver, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You know," he began softly, his voice wavering, "I had started to believe the world had changed too much, that young people today didn't care about us old folks anymore." He paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But you've proved me wrong, Oliver. There's still kindness out there." A warmth spread through Oliver's chest at Gerald's words. "There are plenty of good people in every generation, Mr. Walters," he replied with a gentle smile. "We just have to look out for each other." Oliver stood and offered his hand to Gerald. "Come on," he said kindly. "Let's get you home. We can stop for a bite to eat on the way if you'd like. We can talk about the next steps, or we can just sit quietly. Whatever you need." Gerald took Oliver's hand, his steps a little unsteady but supported by Oliver's steady presence. As they walked out of Aurora Terminal together, the hum of the airport behind them, Oliver knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, legal processes, emotional hurdles, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust and hope. But Oliver was determined to be there for every step of the way. He had entered the situation as a security officer doing his job, but he was leaving it as a friend, committed to helping Gerald navigate the difficult times ahead and rediscover the strength to move forward. Top of form, bottom of form.